stage, Ms. Akansha Khatri, who is Head Nature and Biodiversity at the World Economic Forum, Ms. Shelley Kedia, who is Senior Fellow and Associate Director at the Energy and Resources Institute, India, Mr. Lukhanyo Nir, who is the COO at the Thabo Mbeki Foundation, South Africa, Mr. Kwame Obino, CEO, Institute of Economic Affairs, Kenya, and Mr. N. Lui Kham, who is the Conservator of Forest, Development and Biodiversity and Member Secretary, Meghalaya Biodiversity Board, India. Moderating the session will be Dr. Nilanjan Ghosh, who is Director, Center for New Economic Diplomacy, and ORF Kolkata. Dr. Ghosh, over to you.
Okay.
Hi, everybody. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so thank you, Pramit. And a very good morning to all of you, and welcome to the session on unlocking the value of nature. And I reckon this as a complex problem, more so because in my 2 decades of experience as an ecological economist and a decade of spending, in fact, in the financial derivatives market, I find that those who understand finance hardly understand the natural ecosystem, its processes, functions, and services. And those who understand the natural ecosystem do not really understand the financial instruments. Now, this is indeed a challenge to really find coincidence or some kind of an intersection between 2 very complex disciplines. But the questions here are pretty obvious, that what is the size of funding that is required to meet the conservation goals without compromising with the development goals, and vice versa? Who provides for that? What types of instruments can be used to raise such funds? And who regulates that? How can this funding work? So at the same time, when we talk about the value of nature or natural capital, there remains this very critical challenge of valuing the ecosystem services. This is again fraught with a host of methodological issues, especially when we talk about the aggregation and juxtaposing what we call the provisioning services of the ecosystem with the supporting services of the ecosystem. Now, in fact, very recently, in 2018-19, when UNEP came up with this inclusive wealth report, it shows that in large parts of the global south, the physical or manufactured capital, or what we could, in fact, can better be delineated in the form of physical infrastructure, has grown at the cost of natural capital. Therefore, is it fair to internalize the externality costs in the cost-benefit metrics for the projects that entail such large-scale land use change? Now, in order to respond to these questions, we have a fabulous panel, as has already been mentioned. But before I go to the panel, I would request Akansha Khatri to make an anchor presentation on the basis of which the panelists can actually respond. So it's over to you, Akansha.
Thanks. So thanks, everyone, for having me for this discussion. In the interest of time, I'm going to run through the slides, but they'll be available for you if you want to go through them later. I'm just requesting if... Perfect, yeah. So just for those of you who don't know the World Economic Forum, most of the time we are just known for our annual meeting in Davos, but we are an international organization for public-private cooperation headquartered in Geneva, Switzerland. And our mission and motto is, how do you bring more private entrepreneurship capital into public goods challenges and how we deal with them. Nilanjan already mentioned in his opening on what we are dealing with today. A lot of times, things that we value, things that we prioritize are driven towards greater GDP, greater growth, and greater economic development. Over the last, say, 100 years, that development has brought a lot of benefits to us in terms of health, in terms of education, in terms of prosperity, but it has also come at the cost of our environmental infrastructure. When we say nature, we really go by the definition of science-based targets for nature and really look at nature in different realms. So there are the non-living realms of freshwater, land, and oceans or marine. But then when I talk about biodiversity, what we mean is ecosystems, species, and genes. Or very simply, you could look at species and spaces. That's how you define nature. At the World Economic Forum, our flagship report is the Annual Global Risks Report. So this is a survey done globally. Primarily, 80% of the audience is business and quite senior at that. And what we have seen over the years, increasingly, environmental concerns are rising at the top of the agenda, of which failure to mitigate climate change, failure for adaptation, but also ecosystem collapse is at the very top when we look at the long-term outlook. We then did like a double click of the risk report and tried to understand what is the risk if tomorrow there is a collapse in ecosystems and ecosystem services. And our report found out that more than half of the world's GDP is moderately or highly dependent on nature and its services, and therefore at the risk of disruption. But businesses don't only respond to risks, they also like to see opportunities. And so the second report we did, going beyond the risks into opportunity, is really that if we pivot towards a nature-positive economy, away from a business-as-usual scenario, we can unlock $10.1 trillion of opportunities and create 395 million jobs. And therefore proving that it's actually a myth to say that economy and ecology are at odds with each other. I think for some of you may be knowing this, but in the context is December of last year in Montreal, Canada, 196 parties, which is 195 countries and European Union, agreed to the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. So this is what could be seen as the Paris Agreement for Nature. And these are the main targets which have been put forward. But to meet these targets, we need both new financing as well as repurposing existing perverse incentives. I want to bring maybe 4 case studies here. I won't go into too many details, but just bring a perspective from around the world on how market-based mechanisms are being used for both financing, conservation, restoration, and sustainable management. So if we look at Australia tabled with the new government, Australia Nature Repair Market Bill, which tries to look at creating an opportunity where project developers can put credits or credit schemes out there, which can then be bought either in the regulatory or voluntary market. Canada is currently doing a pilot for the next 3 years, working with private sector investment and conservation projects and looking to actually have a balance of a biodiversity benefit by bringing in private sector finance. UK actually is launching something called the UK Biodiversity Net Gain, and this is also driven for holders, owners of land and project developers. If they can actually show an uplift on biodiversity, they can actually get either funding from the government or actually sell those credits to the private sector as well. And then the last piece as a concept I just wanted to put is Colombia and Inter-American Development Bank have been experimenting with this idea of a habitat bank. And I think that discussion is quite relevant for Meghalaya as well, is that for a nation or a state looking at, look, we need to develop but also protect nature, what should be our opportunity cost? So they have really come up with this idea of a habitat bank. So I'm going to leave us here and over to you then, Nilanjan.
That's fabulous, fabulous, sensating, and exactly dot on time, in 5 minutes. Thank you, Akanksha. And I presume that it's not merely an anchor presentation, but he has raised, rather invoked, a host of questions and concerns. And World Economic Forum, we know that what it represents, primarily the private sector as such. So from here, I'd like to go to the Meghalaya government representative here, Mr. Loikham. What do you think that how things can evolve and how government can incentivize or entice private sector in investing in something that apparently has this public goods character?
Thank you, sir. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, dear delegates from various parts of the world and the country, my colleagues from Meghalaya and the team here. I don't have much to say. I just want to give a little perspective from Meghalaya point of view and perhaps from the Indian context. Since it's about unlocking the values of biodiversity, I just want to quickly point out that we have a national legislation already in place and corresponding rules. We call it the National Biodiversity Act, Biological Diversity Act of the country 2002. And under this arrangement, we have this concept of excess benefit sharing. I think India was one of the first countries and leading countries as far as biodiversity concerns are concerned, steps being taken by the governments concerned. Under this, there is a huge opportunity to be, explored. If I may just quote a figure, I was just interacting with the NBO officials. They informed that we had managed to collect, as of now, under the ABS arrangements, 1.3 billion rupees, 130 crores. So there is, I see it as an opportunity, big opportunity there, and especially in the context of this landscape in northeastern part of India. Here we have a typical land tenure system where the ownership lies with the individuals and the community. You talk about any northeastern states, story is more or less the same. And if we can encourage this, I think this will incentivize the people to go for ABS. Of course, there are pitfalls there as well, but looking at the financial constraints and the opportunities that exist there, financial resources that are likely to come in if we implement this ABS arrangements, excess benefit sharing arrangements, I will see a lot of scope there. So this is in the context of Northeast because of the typical situations that we have here. And the second aspect that we also need to look into, I feel, is the livelihood aspect. If we take care of the livelihood aspects of the people, then the impact on the biodiversity, meaning to say the load on the biodiversity resources can be diffused. I mean to say, like, if we approach it at the landscape level, so I'm talking about the entire northeastern states and maybe neighboring states, neighboring countries as well. So reducing the load on biodiversity. So livelihood issues, like yesterday we were intensely discussing about this living root bridges. Meghalaya has other potentials as well. We have some of the most beautiful cave systems in this Asia-Pacific region. I think some of the longest cave systems are also here, measuring about 31 odd kilometers depth. And I feel that there is a lot of potential to develop caving-based tourism as well. And on these lines, I think the investments, the potentials that we expect for the investments may be seen to be, exploit some of these opportunities that exist here to improve the livelihood issues and also the ABS mechanisms, for which we need a platform. And I think international bodies such as this can bring the relevant stakeholders of this landscape in a platform so that we can discuss and come out with a better option and opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, and thanks for sticking to the time. From here, I'll come to a think tank, maybe Shelly. So Shelly, you heard two responses out here, one from the private sector, the other from the government sector, how government can work with the private sector as such. So what do you think, how an organization, a think tank or a research organization can essentially embrace such a process or augment such a process?
Thank you so much, and I'd just like to begin by thanking the organizers and also the government of Meghalaya for such a warm welcome and exposition to the many biodiversity initiatives. So when we talk about biodiversity financing, which is a specific topic, and this issue is relevant to both government as well as private sector. But first, I'd like to speak from the government side, and I'd just like to reiterate that that as a think tank, we do think that the role of government or the state is absolutely paramount. And for example, like market mechanisms such as carbon finance, which was also one of the framing questions, are really more like supplementary based on the work that Terry has undertaken. To begin with, on the public finance side, while there are many estimates on biodiversity finance, but just to pick one by Paulson Institute, the estimated annual gap of biodiversity finance between 2020 to 2030 was about $711 billion US dollars. And this is, of course, based on what could be valued. And the report suggests, and Akansha also mentioned, that a lot of it could do by repurposing harmful subsidies to perhaps like biodiversity conservation related activities, specifically when we talk about agriculture subsidies, fishery subsidies, as well as some subsidies that are linked to forest. And then, of course, there is also a huge chunk that can come from budgetary resources as well as fiscal instruments like taxes. So definitely public finance and public finance instruments are absolutely key. So as a part of the expenditure aspect of public finance, we at TERI are promoting a concept called green budgeting. And in case of Bihar, in last 3 years itself, there was a jump of about 35% of green budgeting budget. And more importantly, the number of budget lines or schemes tripled. So more and more people are integrating environment. More recently, we also worked with the government of Puducherry, and their green budget increased by a whopping 153% from the baseline year of the previous fiscal year. So definitely this is one of the instruments which, just wanted to share. The second aspect in the framing question was about the role of carbon markets. And as also was previously pointed by, Iram in the previous session, when we generally talk about carbon markets, it's based on timber and biomass, the costing of it. TERI did a study in 3 tiger reserves of Peech, Dudhwa, and Periyar in Kerala. And generally, the findings was that if you just look at the percentage, and if you just costed whatever could be valued, about 11% came from carbon and biomass-related stocks, and 89% was from ecosystem services, which at the moment is not duly factored in carbon markets, existing carbon markets. So that is, definitely, and coming because, one of the objectives is to come up with messages for G20. So, if there could be carbon markets or, well, not carbon markets, ecosystem markets, that could be developed, that could duly factor all the ecosystem services, that, could be one of these strong messages. Even in carbon markets, the prices fluctuate so much, so, if that could be pegged. Just about 10 days ago, India did notify the carbon trading scheme and the carbon market scheme, which is, basically the trading platform is with the power exchange, and it's largely under the Energy Conservation Act. Of course, also just 2 days later, the government also notified the draft green credit, rules, which include some activities related to biodiversity and under the larger mission of lifestyle for environment. And this is largely applicable to individuals as well as institutions. It would be interesting to say that if this does come into force after 60 days of what's mandatory as public consultation, how that would be synced to the carbon market, which is a carbon trading market, which has also been notified. But then again, I think all these experiments are initiatives. What Meghalaya has done with the biodiversity hotspots does solve a lot of market or public or private sector issues of information asymmetry and search costs. Because if that information is available at one place, so that is, an interesting experiment to see, where it takes us. So I'll end here. Thank you.
Thank you, Shaili. And thanks for bringing out this existing divergence between markets, prices, and the values of ecosystem services. Indeed, there is a divergence because markets are generally inefficient. Efficient market hypothesis doesn't work for environmental markets, and that is precisely why the values diverge from the prices. So we can come on that later on. But I'd like to move to Mr. Ovino. So, how do you think that in other parts of the global south, such a market phenomenon, and especially the pricing and the valuation phenomenon, can emerge?
Right. Good morning, everyone. And, I think the way to look at it as a student of economics is this. One of the ways, I think the price mechanism is an extremely powerful mechanism. and unlike many other people, I have a little more faith in it than I would have in government fiat. I say that respectfully. And one of the things that a price mechanism allows you to do is to condense as much information as is possible in a single price. So that's the first point. The second point for me is that prices are relative. So there are no absolute prices. So if we have insufficient ecological services, it's a suggestion that prices for some services, obviously, relative to others, are far from what we think would be ideal, or at least does not meet our normative ideals. So I think the price mechanism is still essential for public goods, such as what we are speaking about. And so I think one of the things governments need to ask or need to be aware of is how do we make sure that we try and bring the prices of ecological services to reflect their real value to society and generally. Coming now to the fact that we are obviously clear that there's insufficient investment, or at least given the prices and the quantities, it's clear to us that, or rather the depletion of goods and services that generate positive value environmentally, one of the things is clear to us is that it suggests that there's insufficient production or conservation. And I think that here, again, with respect to what the other speakers have said, I think I agree that it's very, very difficult to get enough investment, or at least enough capital or finance out there. Or at least at this moment, there isn't sufficient finance. So one of the ways to do that is, I think the greatest harm, based on what the science says, ecological sciences say, to ecological services come from greenhouse gases. And so if you attach a good price to carbon, specifically, among others, and especially a carbon tax, it's a difficult thing to coordinate globally. These are coordination problems globally. But if we can get a price even at the domestic level, government achieves two things. One, you get less of the things that you don't desire, because when you raise the price of a good, obviously you get less of it through taxation. And any revenues that come could actually be redirected back to pay for ecological services. So in other words, you try and burn the candles from both sides. By getting taxes, you reduce the quantity of harmful substances, and on the other side, the revenue that is generated is used to support ecological services. And I think, for instance, using it whether to grow forests or to generate clean energy and stuff like that would actually be more useful. And then coming now to how, so in my view, one of the biggest solutions that I think economists think would be viable and would work is a carbon tax. Now, whether that can be agreed to globally is completely a different question, because it's very, very difficult to get the political consensus. The economics of it, in my view, is very solid. And I think that's part of the thing that needs to be stated. And I think one of it is that two things could be achieved. One would be new investments into ecological services, or at least goods and services that allow for ecological services to thrive. And the second one would actually be to give a tax cut to people, because that's the only way. Otherwise, it's very, very difficult globally and for politicians to carry forward the idea that we are raising new taxes. I mean, it's a big problem in Kenya today. We've just had a new tax bill that has been completely, brought different divides together, and people are completely opposed to it. But I think that there's no way we are getting out of this without government using revenues from taxation of carbon and other harmful substances and redirecting those to support ecological services protection, but also for these to thrive. Thanks.
Thank you. And a host of options, of course, he spoke of. So, Mr. Lukhanoni, it's up to you. How do you respond to these questions?
So I don't think I'm going to respond to the questions. I had anticipated that I'd speak last. So my set of interventions are slightly divergent and deliberately provocative. So there's essentially three messages I want us to highlight off the back of my intervention today. Is that, and my intervention is really coming from the back of an African perspective, right? And the first is that the African continent has largely been relegated to the sidelines of the global agenda in the last number of years. That's the first point. The second point is that our current approach to climate justice is only poised to increase injustice across the African continent. And the third is that there's obviously then a need for us to be able to mobilize financing both for economic, social, as well as environmental challenges. unfortunately for the global south and the continent of Africa in particular, we do not have the luxury of only being able to focus on environmental challenges at the expense of social and economic challenges, right? So these are the three things I'm going to drive in the 3 minutes, 45 seconds I have left, right? So if you really look at the global agenda, say, since 2001, let's say 2000, the African continent begins with a very intentional and ambitious program in 2001 with the NEPAD program. Right? That was really about driving and getting cooperation from the global north, particularly the G8, to partner with the African continent in very tangible ways and not in a manner that's really about just charity. Right? That's 2001. 2002, we then have the G8's Africa Action Plan. That was in 2002. That was equally building off the NEPAD program and was really one of the most ambitious development plans that the globe had for the African continent. What happened with those two programs, there have been multiple other ones that have taken place over the years, is that the global north and the G8 countries in particular have not honored their promises. Right? They make a whole host of pledges, they make a whole host of commitments, but really don't come to the party at the end of the day. Right? And these kinds of partnerships and these kinds of broken promises essentially make it very difficult for us to think about a future that takes us towards a more sustainable development moving forward, right? So when we think about climate finance moving forward then, and we understand that the significant financing gaps that the African continent has, as well as the global south have, the kind of expectations that we have as a continent on the rest of the world in developed nations, again, it's a futile expectation at the moment for me, right? And I think if we are unable to deal directly with those challenges, we're really wasting our time. The second point I wanted to make was the idea that we need to bring back to the forefront, especially when we talk financing, the key principle of common but differentiated. And I think it's very deliberate in our leaving it off the table in our conversations. Right? And I think if we need to bring it back to the forefront, because again, the global south has made the least impact on climate change, but are set to experience some of the worst effects of it, right? But then we're then expected again to respond in a common approach. That can't be it, right? The last point I wanted to make was, so how then we finance it? And so there are 2 points I wanted to make. There's one proposal that's rooted in illicit financial flows. We, on the African continent, lose around $89 billion every single year. And most of those funds are moved to the developed nations. There needs to be a particularly bold action by developed nations, again, particularly European nations now, and some of these tax havens, to drive a bold response to have capital flight repatriation, right? So 2 things must happen there. One, there must be capital flight repatriation. So all this capital that's sitting in Swiss banks, in Luxembourg, in tax havens across the world, these governments must return that funds back to the African continent. That allows us to bridge the kind of financing gap that we have at the moment, right? This is not new money, this is existing money. There is always money that belongs to the continent. That's the first part. The second part, I know I'm over, just 15 more seconds, please. The second one is around, there's an interesting proposal that come out of the 2002 process with the Africa Action Agenda. And they were rejected for some reasonable reasons, but I think we must revisit them now for innovative mechanisms. So Tony Blair and Gordon Brown talk about an international finance facility, right? What that was at the time was about having the challenge we have with biodiversity loss and these climate change financing, that we need large amounts of money up front in order for us to gain and reap these fruits in the end. And what this facility was about was really about getting these developed nations to front the money up and front load it, and then to set up government bonds that would then be paid off over a period of time. So those are the two proposals that I think must be brought back to the table now.
Great. And thanks for bringing into this entire discourse the climate justice debate. So, of course, it was provocative. Now, we have around 13 and a half minutes. I think that we won't get into a second round. Rather, we open this to the floor for a discussion and questions and answers. So please feel free to shoot your questions. If you please raise your hands. Yes, at the very front, lady at the front. And please introduce yourself also to the panelists.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for the enriching panel. I'm Camila Santos. I'm from the Rio de Janeiro City Hall. And I was trying to get back to the taxation discussion that you just introduced. We have the feeling that, I have the feeling that taxation works a lot when we are thinking about rich countries and richer cities and a particular kind of society that has the per capita for that. So when you come to our reality in the Global South, how do you expect that taxation should, and again, making the cross cut with your presentation, how do you expect that the Global South could tax their citizens and make this work? In the long term, I don't see how this could be implemented in an efficient way in our societies. So I get back to the panel, which are the other instruments that you think we may have, considering, of course, that the debt has not been paid by the North. And if I may, I think this question is more directed to you at the World Economic Forum, because is where we can get funding at this point.
Okay, we take maybe one or two more questions and get back to the panel. Yes, at the back.
Hi, this is Gokul. I'm an IT consultant, and I was interested in cryptocurrencies. Kwame rightly mentioned about the importance of the price discovery mechanism and the volatility that is there in the valuation. In any class where the value is not clear, I'm sure that there will be volatility. But do you think for people and businesses to plan, what are the things that governments can do to reduce the volatility? Can it bring in something like long-term staking of this carbon credit so that like people can plan future ahead of that? That's the first question. And the second question is, since this is a very immature market, both the demand side and supply side are not smooth and organic. So for example, let's say government makes it mandatory for bigger companies to buy credits, suddenly the prices can go up. Or let us say they mark farmers as like people who are preserving the biodiversity, or like people who are safeguarding the forest. So suddenly the supply side goes up. So how can businesses plan for this when they're very sure that both the demand and supply side are subject to sudden changes which are not under their control? This is particularly for Kwame, since he brought up some interesting points.
Okay. Any other question from the floor? We can take one more. Yes, sir.
Thank you. My question is again to Akanksha. Three models which you presented, probably those are a good way of going forward, especially from the biodiversity perspective. And Meghalaya has set that tone. So where do you see that from northeastern India perspective, where biodiversity hotspots are also important and forest view is entirely different than the mainland India? Where do you find that these models could be a good tool to move forward on moving towards these? Thank you.
Yeah, we take the last one and then we go to the panelists.
Yeah. My question is to Ms. Shali. You mentioned that, yes, and we are all aware that we have a huge challenge for valuing ecosystem services. And we are aware that TERI has done several studies in this area. Do you means what? And recently, you means you in your in your presentation you mentioned that you have done one study on 3 national parks also. So what is the latest in this area? We have been hearing for quite some time that have we reached on some kind of standard ecosystem service valuation mechanism, methodology? I will just like to hear from you.
We begin with Akanksha responding to all the questions.
Sure.
Kwame, Kanu, then Shelly and Mr. Mukam.
I'll start with the question from you, Camilla. So I think, first of all, financing for nature will not come from any single source. There's not going to be one silver bullet which will fix everything. So I think most people are looking for a basket of approaches and knowing that the funding will come from different approaches. On the taxation piece, you raise a good point that if the overall GDP of an economy or a sub-jurisdiction is low, can taxation actually bring that money in? I would challenge the thinking a little bit, is saying it's not about taxing people only, it's also taxing business and economic activity. And Nilanjan said that in the beginning, is today the economic activities do not account for environmental externality, and that's a fundamental problem of the economic discipline. Like, how did we decide that this is an externality, but this is a value? And in Europe, for example, since you brought up the point on the global north and the south, I fully am with you. If we just purely look at the consumption pattern in the global north compared to, I think we had looked at one study even in South Sudan, it's like the difference is like of 1 in 300. So it's about, in Europe, there's a lot of discussion right now on imported deforestation, imported negative externalities for the environment. So I think that's where the taxation should be, and not for like bringing more burden over there. And then the second question that you raised on the forest reality being different in Meghalaya, this is just an offer, and I know I want to, after the session, discuss with him. Biodiversity is, by definition, complex and diverse, so there's not going to be one size fits all. So how can we actually work with local communities and the state to come up with a market product structure that works here? And the idea of Habitat Bank actually is just a structure. What you put into is different. Another example that one of the economists has been using is a basket of metrics. So if you look at the consumer price index, it doesn't matter where in the world you are, everybody uses CPI. It's just that the basket of metrics in India will be very different from the basket of metrics in, say, South Africa or UK. So I'm sure we can come up with solutions. We just have to look at nature as an opportunity and not an externality.
Thank you, Akanksha. Kwame.
Right. I think she's answered the question, but let me go back to it, Camilla. Actually, when you look at the data, it is not true that developing, or I don't like the division south and north. It makes no sense completely. But for the purposes of argument, let me state this. It is not true that developing countries have low capacity for taxation generation. It isn't. So for instance, the country that I come from, Kenya, an income per capita of $2,800 per person per year. When the US was at $2,800 per person per year, the government taxation as a share of GDP was 7%. In Kenya, it is 21%. So basically, we have a low-income country with a very advanced mechanism for extracting taxes from people. So I don't think that it's necessarily that division would work. Now, what other instruments? I think as she said before, there's going to have to be a diversity of instruments. But I think carbon taxation makes sense because it's measurable. And you could do it by basically a unit of taxes, or we can do it like the US and North America did in the mid-80s, which was basically when you had acid rains. They simply decided to cap the volumes that would be produced, and then a price generates from that end. It's still possible to do it here. On the final question about for people, how can governments stabilize prices? I think it's that. You can simply decide by capping the volume of emissions, for instance, and using that money to subsidize ecological services. That's possible, because obviously that's one way of cutting it both ways, and you'll get an even quantity. And this could be adjusted over time because prices tend to change over time. So there's no silver bullet, but actually methods that have worked and have solid grounding in microeconomics could be applicable here. Thanks.
Kanu.
Sure. The questions went for me, so I'll reflect on something else, which might respond to or not. I think the other mechanism is, and I was thinking about it when the Titan sank, or around why we're seeing so much migration in West Africa. And a big part of the driver, at least in the Senegal example, is thinking about the EU and Senegal EU subsidies, right? That essentially these EU subsidies are depleting fishing stocks off the coast of West Africa, right? So, which is then causing people from Senegal to now increasingly migrate to Europe and have a whole host of issues that come about as a result of that. There needs to be a concerted effort in reducing and or removing these subsidies. And I think in this basket of solutions we're talking about, the subsidies question is another one that we're thinking about as a way of at least augmenting the need for revenues as well.
Great. Shelly, on the valuation question.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. But just before that, I'd just like to also mention on the taxation part. India, for instance, also has has a cess on coal. So, you know, when we're talking about taxation, and the initial concept was that cess goes to a national clean energy, and then later on, National Clean Energy and Environment Fund. And, you know, that could also partly be a source of biodiversity finance. Of course, because of the GST transition here, you know, this fund is still in a process of flux. Coming to the valuation question, in fact, this is a question, I think, you know, the methodologies are still evolving, but just, you know, wanted to highlight this very interesting concept in ecological economics of incommensurability of values, which means that values need not, you know, there might be situations where values need not be expressed in one unit. And largely when we are talking about finance, the unit is, you know, is monetary. We tend to monetize, you know, even ecosystem services. And, you know, perhaps one has to be more creative. For instance, even in the National Environment Policy of 2006, similar and inspired by this principle of value incommensurability, there is a concept of entities of incomparable value. So maybe, you know, you could have geographical areas with entities of incomparable value, and, you know, I think the experiments with biodiversity heat spots, we see where it goes. But coming to Terry's own work, and I'm speaking actually more, you know, from our colleagues who are based with the biodiversity and forestry team at Terry, and they are actually figuring out a host of methodologies for, you know, ecosystem services in various contexts. So right now, the largest portfolio where things, you know, where India has the largest potential is on agroforestry. So for that, the methodology is different. For protected areas, the methodology is different, and the valuation is different. But for protected area, for instance, in Terry, we've been inspired by the community, by the climate community and biodiversity index. That's like, you know, one of the metrics Terry has developed. For agroforestry and working with farmers, it's different. So I think, you know, it's still evolving. But there are also, just wanted to end on a note of caution that, you know, there are still issues, and we need to think more creatively and going beyond monetary values.
Right, absolutely. Mr. Luikam, some words from you.
For me, from my side, I think I'll again fall back to that unlocking the values of biodiversity, and we're talking about financing. Financing from the perspective of biodiversity conservation. So it's already there inbuilt in the acts, the central acts and the corresponding rules of the state government as well. I'm coming back to this excess benefit sharing. It looks like a tax. Per se, it's not a tax, but it's a fee which the village level institutions are supposed to collect and utilize that money for the development of biodiversity. Basically, it means biodiversity conservation. And with that, it's expected that we will improve our biodiversity footprint. While doing so, we reduce the carbon footprint as well.
Okay, so the time is almost up, but I think it is pertinent to also respond to the question of valuation that the gentleman raised on a different note. So, which Shelly is absolutely spot on the concern related to monetization of nature and monetization of ecosystem services. But let's face it, that why I wanted to raise this question, because this is a very provocative question on the one hand. As far as the methodology is concerned, yes, it is indeed emerging. The fact remains that in 2006, when the Kanchan Chopra committee actually emerged with the NPV, Net Present Value of Forest report, that essentially considered barely 7 or 8 ecosystem services. That was a report that was submitted to the Supreme Court committee, to the Supreme Court. And eventually in 2021, a new committee has been set up, in fact, where I am also a member, so that entire valuation mechanism has been changed by now. And more so because of carbon is one of the elements. At that point in time, they took into consideration the certified emission reduction prices, but the CER prices, ever since that time, has nosedived, especially after the Lehman Brothers crisis and the subprime crisis, because there's not sufficient industrial demand for carbon. Now, the other way of looking at this entire carbon mechanism is looking at the SCC, the social cost of carbon. So that has emerged, in fact, with the IIFM report of Madhu Verma. Then we have also worked on the social cost of carbon, and we have emerged with a new methodology as well. The third point is, which all the reports, starting from Bob Costanza's landmark paper in 1997 in Nature, and coming up to 2005, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, all these reports, in certain cases, considered the supporting services of the ecosystem along with other services of the ecosystem, which led to double counting. So now that has also been corrected. And eventually, what we find is that all these methods, models, aggregation procedures, these are also emerging globally, as also in India. So it's not that India is lagging behind. We are at the frontiers of the discipline in terms of methodological development as well. But at the same time, which I completely agree with Lucano, when we look at ecosystem services and their values, it needs a global south statement. That is more so because ecosystem services are GDP of the poor. We have developed an index at ORF known as the Ecosystem Dependency Index, Ecosystem Dependency Ratio. Now, that is simply the value of the ecosystem services, ratio of the value of the ecosystem services and income of the community. In many cases, we find that this ecosystem dependency ratio is greater than 1, especially in poverty-stricken areas. That means the poor is extracting more from the ecosystem services than what they are getting, in fact, as income from the formal and informal employment. So these are some of the critical notions that need to be included in our entire development paradigm, because nature is inextricably linked with development. So it's not that this is something tangential or this is something that is asymptotic to our development process. Rather, we need to look at the system as a broader social ecological system, and conservation at this point in time doesn't emerge as a moral statement from the books of morality. Rather, it is a selfish human need. So we need to conserve nature because we are earning out of it. So with those words, let me end this session because the time is up and I have taken, I think, 3 minutes more. So I just request the organizers to excuse me for that. Thank you, and thanks for being a fabulous audience.